And Diego fucked me. Cut me out too.
1967, Manhattan Beach, California. A 25-year-old kid from Weymouth, Massachusetts, is sitting on a beach with sand between his toes and a joint between his fingers. He dropped out of college after one semester. He has no money, no plan, and no particular ambition beyond not going back to the town where his father's business just went bankrupt. His name is George Jung. Within 15 years, he will claim to have smuggled 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. He will claim to have worked directly with Pablo Escobar. He will claim to have made $100 million and lost every cent. Johnny Depp will play him in a major motion picture. The final scene of that movie, a broken old man crying alone in a prison visiting room, imagining his daughter walking toward him, will make audiences weep in theaters across America. There was one problem with that story. The biggest claim at the center of it, the one the entire movie is built around, the one that turns a mid-level drug smuggler from Massachusetts into a cinematic tragic hero, has no verifiable evidence supporting it. George Jung may never have met Pablo Escobar, and if he didn't, then the movie Blow isn't a true story about a man who flew too close to the sun. It's a myth about a man who built his own sun out of interviews and book deals, and a screenplay that needed a protagonist worthy of Johnny Depp. But this isn't a video about calling George Jung a liar. It's about something more specific. It's about the moment the movie shows you the scene where Johnny Depp walks onto Escobar's ranch in Colombia and shakes the hand of the most powerful drug lord in history, and what the available evidence actually says about whether that handshake ever happened. Because if it didn't, the entire structure of Blow collapses, and what's left underneath is a story the movie couldn't afford to tell because it's smaller, sadder, and in some ways more interesting than the version Hollywood sold you. The movie opens with a kid watching his father go bankrupt. Ray Liotta kneels next to 10-year-old George and says money isn't real. It doesn't matter if you have it or you don't. What matters is what you do with your life. That scene is the emotional spine of the entire film. It sets up every choice George makes afterward, and it sets up the ending, where an old man in prison finally understands what his father meant. Beautiful screenwriting. But in real life, George Jung almost never talked about his father in interviews. Not on Vlad TV, not on PBS Frontline, not in any of the recorded conversations from the 2 decades he spent as a minor celebrity after prison. The sentimental father-son relationship that anchors the movie appears primarily in Bruce Porter's 1993 book, which is told entirely from Jung's perspective. No independent verification that Frederick Jung delivered those speeches. There's no interview with Frederick. He's a character in his son's story, and his son was, as we will see, one of the most unreliable narrators in the history of American crime. The real beginning is less cinematic and more telling. George Jacob Jung was born August 6, 1942, in Weymouth, Massachusetts. His father, Frederick, ran a small business. His mother, Ermin, came from an Irish family. The family was lower middle class, close enough to the edge that when Frederick's business failed and he filed for bankruptcy, the impact was permanent. George watched his father lose everything and decided that he would never be poor. He graduated from Weymouth High School in 1961. He was a star football player. Classmates described him as a natural leader. He also, and this is something the movie never mentions, was charged by an undercover police officer for solicitation of prostitution while still in high school. Not exactly the innocent small-town kid the movie opens with. He briefly attended the University of Southern Mississippi, considered studying advertising, and dropped out. He moved to Manhattan Beach and discovered marijuana. Here's where the facts get interesting, because the early drug career is well documented and it shows you the real George Jung, the one the movie accurately captures. He noticed that marijuana cost $60 a kilo in California and $300 a kilo on the East Coast. This is the single most important observation of his life, not because it made him rich, but because it reveals the only genuine talent George Jung ever had. He could see a price gap and figure out how to exploit it. He wasn't a chemist. He wasn't a strategist. He was an arbitrageur with a willingness to break the law. His first operation was simple. His girlfriend, Barbara Buckley, was a flight attendant. She carried marijuana in her suitcases on commercial flights. Barbara is one of the few people in this story the movie gets almost completely right. She was real. She was a stewardess. She did help smuggle drugs, and she did die of cancer. Franca Potente plays her in the movie with warmth and sadness, and for once the Hollywood version and the reality align. I mention this because it matters. When a movie gets something right, this channel says so. That way, when we tell you something the movie got wrong, you know we checked. From suitcases, Jung graduated to small planes. He and his associates flew marijuana from Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, using aircraft stolen from private airports on Cape Cod. He later told PBS in a Frontline interview, "We used to take 600 to 800 pounds of pot at a time in these single-engine planes into the United States. And we were basically getting it for $20 a kilo down there and selling it anywhere between $300 to $350 in the United States." At the height of the marijuana operation, Jung was making $250,000 a month. In today's money, that's over $2 million. For a college dropout from Weymouth, that's extraordinary. It's also the peak of what George Jung demonstrably accomplished on his own. Everything that comes after requires trusting his word. In 1974, Jung was arrested in Chicago with 660 pounds of marijuana. He'd been staying at the Playboy Club, waiting to meet a connection who turned out to be under investigation for heroin trafficking. The connection ratted him out. Jung was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, and in Danbury he met the man who would actually change his life, not Pablo Escobar. Carlos Lehder, Carlos Enrique Lehder Rivas, was a Colombian-German car thief with ambitions that dwarfed Jung's. He was young, charismatic, had connections back in Colombia, and understood something Jung didn't. Cocaine was about to explode. The price differential was even more insane than marijuana. A kilo of cocaine cost $4,000 to $5,000 in Colombia and sold for $60,000 in the United States. When Lehder laid out those numbers in their shared cell at Danbury, Jung said the cash register started ringing in his head. It was like a match made in heaven, Jung told PBS, or hell in the end. This part the movie gets right. The prison meeting happened. The partnership happened. Court records from the 1987 Lehder trial confirm that Jung testified about their shared incarceration and subsequent collaboration. They got out around the same time in 1975 and started moving cocaine almost immediately. The method was ingenious for its time. Jung had the aviation smuggling expertise. Lehder had the Colombian supply connections. They used female couriers carrying Samsonite suitcases on commercial flights from Colombia through the Caribbean to the United States. Later, they graduated to private aircraft. The operation was small at first, a few kilos at a time, but it scaled fast. Now, here is where the movie begins to diverge from the verifiable record, and the divergence grows wider with every scene. In Blow, the partnership with Lehder, who the film calls Diego Delgado, ends when Diego betrays George by cutting him out and dealing directly with George's California distributor, a man played by Paul Rubens in the movie. The real distributor was named Richard Bareil. He died in 2011. The cutout happened. Lehder did go directly to Bareilles. That much is confirmed by trial testimony, but the movie frames this as a personal betrayal. A friend stabbing a friend in the back. The reality was structural. By 1978, Lehder had purchased a private island in the Bahamas for $4.5 million and turned it into his own cocaine airport. He had his own pilots, his own boats, his own security. He didn't need Jung's aviation contacts anymore because he had built something bigger than anything Jung could offer. This wasn't betrayal. It was a business outgrowing its founding partner. Jung provided the initial logistics knowledge. Once Lehder absorbed that knowledge and built his own infrastructure, Jung was redundant. So in August 2025, Lehder gave a rare English-language interview to Michael Franzese on YouTube. At the 16-minute and 38-second mark, he discusses the Jung partnership directly. He describes it as a brief collaboration that ended when their operations diverged. Not with anger, not with drama, with simple business logic. The movie needed to be a betrayal because the script needs George Jung to be a victim of other people's greed. The real version, where Jung was simply outgrown, doesn't generate sympathy. It generates a shrug. And this is where the movie has a problem. Lehder is gone. The partnership is over. The script needs a new partner for George. Someone bigger, someone whose name alone justifies the next 45 minutes of screen time. So the movie gives him Pablo Escobar. The question is whether real life ever did. Think about that scene. Johnny Depp steps off a small plane onto a dirt airstrip somewhere in Colombia, mountains in the background. Armed men on either side of the road. Cliff Curtis, playing Escobar, walks toward him with a slow, deliberate smile. They shake hands. They make a deal. From that moment on, according to the movie, George Jung becomes Escobar's primary American cocaine importer. He makes $3 to $5 million a week. He lives in mansions. He attends parties surrounded by mountains of cash. He becomes what he later called a coke star. That scene is the heart of the film. Without it, George Jung is a mid-level marijuana smuggler who briefly partnered with a Colombian car thief and then got arrested. With it, he's a man who stood next to the most powerful drug lord in history and helped build an empire. Johnny Depp doesn't sign on for the first version of that story, neither does any studio. Here's what the evidence says. The current Wikipedia entry on George Jung contains this sentence: "There is no verifiable evidence in judicial records, declassified enforcement files, or academic literature that Jung ever met or worked directly with Pablo Escobar or other Medellin leaders." That sentence cites federal court records from the Lehder trial, declassified DEA intelligence assessments, and 3 separate academic studies published over the last 2 decades. All of them describe Jung as an independent American smuggler who operated briefly alongside Lehder before Lehder's integration into the Medellin network. None of them placed Jung in direct contact with Escobar. No court record puts him at Escobar's ranch. No DEA intelligence file names him as a cartel associate. So where does the story come from? Exactly 2 places. George Jung's own mouth, and a book based entirely on what came out of it. Bruce Porter's 1993 book, Blow: How a Small-Town Boy Made $100 Million with the Medellin Cocaine Cartel and Lost It All. The title alone tells you what the publisher needed the story to be. And Jung, at the time he told these stories, had every reason in the world to inflate his role. He was trying to reduce a 60-year prison sentence. He was trying to sell a book. He was trying to attract Hollywood interest in his life story. A marijuana smuggler who briefly worked with a car thief doesn't get any of those things. A man who shook hands with Pablo Escobar gets all 3. In the movie, George says he was bringing in 85% of the cocaine in the United States. He's standing in a room full of money when he says it. The Medellin cartel as a whole may have controlled that percentage of the American market at its peak. George Jung personally, the math doesn't work. The cartel had dozens of transportation networks running simultaneously through Mexico, the Caribbean, Central America, and direct air routes. Jung's operation, even at its largest, was one small pipeline among many. Attributing 85% of the American cocaine supply to one smuggler from Massachusetts is like attributing 80% of Amazon's revenue to one delivery driver. But the claim served everyone's interests. It served Jung because it made him important enough to write a book about. It served Porter because it made the book more dramatic. It served the filmmakers because it justified building a 124-minute movie around this particular life. And it served the audience because Americans love a story about one man against the world, even when that man is a drug smuggler. Roger Ebert, reviewing Blow in 2001, wrote something that now reads as accidentally prophetic. That's the thing about George. He thinks it's all about him. His life, his story, his success, his fortune, his lost fortune. Actually, all he did was operate a toll gate between suppliers and addicts. Ebert didn't have the DAA files or the academic citations. He just watched the movie and saw through the character. So now I want to be careful here, because the honest answer is that we don't know for certain. Jung never met Escobar. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's possible they met briefly and the meeting was never documented. What we can say is that the version of events the movie presents, where Jung was Escobar's top American partner and a central figure in the cartel's distribution network, is not supported by anything outside of Jung's own account. And Jung had every reason in the world to make that account as dramatic as possible. George Jung was a toll booth operator who convinced Hollywood he was the highway. Let me tell you what happened after the fairy tale ended, because this is where the movie makes its second major departure from the truth. And this one isn't about inflating the story. It's about making the ending sadder than it actually was. In 1987, Jung was arrested at his home. The movie turns this into a spectacular birthday party raid, FBI agents crashing through the doors while guests scatter and cocaine flies off tables. In reality, it was surveillance, a search, enough cocaine to charge him. He made bail. He tried to flee with his wife Mirtha and their daughter Christina. He was caught. Mirtha Calderone was Colombian and as deep into cocaine as George was. They married in the late 70s. Their daughter Christina Sunshine Jung was born August 1st, 1978. The marriage was volatile. So both were heavy users. Mirtha was arrested, served time, got clean in prison, and was released in 1981. They divorced in 1984. Mirtha got custody of Christina. Jung was arrested in Topeka, Kansas, with 1,754 pounds of cocaine. Not at a birthday party, not at home. In Kansas, on a deal that had been set up through a former associate who was cooperating with the DEA. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of conspiracy and received a 60-year sentence. That sentence was reduced to roughly 20 years after Jung did something the movie skips entirely. He testified against Carlos Lehder, a man who built his legend on loyalty and the outlaw code, cooperated with the federal government, and helped put his former partner in prison. Lehder received life plus 135 years, later reduced to 55 years for his own cooperation. He was released in June 2020 and deported to Germany. Now here's the ending. The real one, not the movie's version. In Blow, the final scene shows an elderly George Jung sitting in a prison visiting room. He imagines his daughter Christina walking toward him. She sits down. They talk. She slowly fades away. She was never there. The title card appears on screen. George Jung will not be eligible for parole until 2015. Christina Sunshine Jung has never visited her father in prison. That scene is devastating. It is also not true. In June 2014, TMZ reported that Jung had been released from prison early, on June 2nd, after nearly 20 years. His representatives told TMZ that Christina had visited him in prison multiple times in the years before his release, and that they had started to reconcile in the past couple of years. 4 years later, in September 2018, Jung posted a video on his own Facebook page saying, "Still to this day I have tried many times to reconcile with my daughter Christina. I cannot change the man I was and the man I am today. The relationship was complicated. It was rocky. It wasn't the fairy tale reunion anyone would hope for, but the movie's claim that Christina never visited, never came, never reached out, was false by the time the credits rolled in 2001. And it was definitely false by 2014. The movie needed that ending. It needed the audience to leave the theater feeling the weight of a wasted life. A father who lost everything, including the one person who mattered. If you tell the audience that Christina actually did visit, that they did try to reconcile, that the story didn't end in permanent tragedy, the emotional payoff dissolves. You're left with something messier and more human, which is a father and daughter who hurt each other, tried to fix it, partially succeeded and kept trying. That's life. It's just not a movie. After his release, Jung lived as something between a folk hero and a cautionary tale. He gave interviews. He appeared on a novel called Heavy. He was active on social media. In 2016, he was jailed for a federal supervision violation, then released from a halfway house in 2017. A 5-part documentary called Boston George, Famous Without the Fortune, debuted on Fandor in 2202. He never went back to prison after 2017. Spent his last years in Weymouth, the same town he'd left as a kid with sand between his toes and a determination to never be poor. Life's a rodeo, he said in one of his final interviews. The only thing you have to do is stay in the saddle, and I'm back in the saddle again. On May 5th, 2021, George Jacob Jung died at his home in Weymouth, Massachusetts. Liver and kidney failure. He was 78 years old. He was receiving hospice care. His death was quiet, at home, with people around him. Not in a prison, not alone, not imagining a daughter who never came. George Jung died in the same town he was born in. Weymouth, Massachusetts. Same zip code as the house where his father went bankrupt. Johnny Depp cried in a prison visiting room for him. 44 million people bought tickets to watch it. The book was called How a Small-Town Boy Made $100 Million. The DEA files call him a brief associate of a Colombian car thief. The machine didn't build George Jung, he built himself out of stories told to journalists and filmmakers and parole boards and talk show hosts. And by the end, the kid from Weymouth who swore he'd never be poor died with almost nothing to his name. He may have been the only person left who believed all of it. If this changed how you think about Johnny Depp crying in that visiting room, subscribe. Every video on this channel does the same thing to a different movie. Next time we go into a story that starts on the streets of the Bronx in 1960. A kid watches a man named Sonny shoot someone in front of a crowded sidewalk and doesn't say a word to the police. Daz Parmenteri swears it happened to him. The movie A Bronx Tale is based on his life. The real Sonny has never been identified, and the reason Parmenteri won't name him tells you more about how the mafia actually operates on a neighborhood level than any FBI wiretap ever could. That story starts here.